back to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. I'm Molly Herford, and when I'm not recording this podcast or writing all about training, nutrition, and endurance sport, I am hopefully outside exploring one of those endurance sports.
And I'm Peter Glassford. I'm a registered kinesiologist and an endurance coach, and you are here on the Consummate Athlete Podcast, where we look at all different types of movements and the people that do them and study them and coach them and whatever they do with them. And, well, we apply it back to our own lives. And today we have David Epstein.
Yeah, which we're super excited about. He's on to talk about his new book, Range. And when we saw that he came out with this book that's kind of all about how the best way to get good at one thing is to actually be kind of good at a lot of different things. We really loved it because when we kind of sat around and came up with this idea for the podcast 3 years ago, The Consummate Athlete, the idea was, how can you be the kind of person who can jump from, going on a hike one day to maybe going rock climbing with friends the next day and then going for a gravel bike ride the day after that, or a bike packing trip followed by a camping trip, and maybe throw some kite surfing in there.
Well, and I think the important thing is, it's not necessarily that you're going to be, an elite anything necessarily. You're going to have to do whatever that thing you're elite at a lot, but a lot of these sports and certainly things like scientific studies, businesses, I'm trying to think even just things you study in school are sort of the culmination of combining disciplines, right? And his argument is largely around these generalists who sort of have breakthroughs by combining like artificial intelligence with some sort of random sport application, right? Or, even just in sports, if you think about, we've talked about the Killarney Trail, which is a running sort of event, but there's a lot of different like strength-based things, and then also like filtering water
let's back up and say it's a running event for us, not for like a normal human who
right, but again, that's the point, is that we're sort of creating, and not that we're doing it, but we're these sports, these mountain sports even, are an example of you're taking someone who's like really good at mountaineering and combining it with someone who's been doing like racing of some type, right? And there's all these different sorts, gravel racing for bikes, we're talking about running.
Well, heck, cyclocross is probably the most range-esque discipline of cycling that I can think of.
Yeah, and so he talks about how whether we're talking about work, different things, were different experiences, and the book has all these great examples of people who have worked in one discipline and then somehow transferred over and just thought about something differently because they weren't in that sort of silo of thinking, we're only a cyclist or we're only an engineer, but then someone comes from another sort of area, right? So the book is amazing. I don't know if you can hear the excitement in my voice, but I read this very quickly, which usually is not how I read things.
Bearing in mind, the excitement in Peter's voice goes from like 0 to 1 on a scale of 0 to 10 in terms of excitement levels, but that was very excited. We actually also just read Range as the Athletic Bookworm's July read over on the OutdoorEdit.com.
So what is that all about?
Yeah, that's my monthly book club. We pick a new book every month that's tangentially sports related. Sometimes it's, extremely sport related. Sometimes it's barely sport related, and it's
and Range is sort of like that, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And honestly, it's really just my excuse to make sure that I stay accountable to reading, and I know there's quite a few other people who choose their books based on it, and then at the end of every month I sort of put together a little wrap up of kind of the main takeaways from each book, some of the best quotes that I found, what got me thinking, all that kind of stuff. So if you go over to theoutdooredit.com this week, you'll be able to see sort of what I took away from the book specifically.
Okay, so before people, like if the podcast maybe doesn't convince them, then they want a little bit more just sort of book review type, like...
Yeah, exactly. If you really want to get an idea of exactly what the book is like, not just what the concept is, then definitely pop over there.
Right.
Yeah, and then... Otherwise, I think we should really just get into this. We start with him talking a lot about youth sport development, which is something that we're both, really interested in as coaches. And I know there's a lot of parents who listen out here that, could probably really benefit from this. We had Katie Maccarelli on a couple months ago talking about how to get your kid into cycling. And one of the things she talks a bunch about is sort of not forcing your child to sort of specialize in one sport. And in this, David kind of explains why it's a really good idea to let your kid kind of explore a bunch of different things.
Yeah, I think that's... We do spend a lot of time on that sort of, I would say even just the pathway of sort of even towards sporting, elite sport, but I think that applies to a lot of things, and we keep certainly as the podcast goes on, we get into work and school and life choices, and I might have a breakdown in the middle and then come back out the other side. But
the amount of midlife crises you have had on this podcast.
Well, I guess it's the nature. It's life.
Absolutely. Well, if you enjoyed this episode, definitely hit us up over on Twitter or on the Consummate Athlete website, which is consummateathlete.com. And then we're at Peter Glassford and at Molly J. Herford on Twitter, Instagram, whatever. Let us know what you liked about it. Maybe even use I think it's the Overdrive app that I've been using to share little bits and pieces from podcasts
oh, right. You can
that
pull
I'm really
out those
liking.
Fancy links and use it for Instagram posts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into it. Enjoy this conversation with David Epstein. David Epstein, welcome to the Consummate Athlete podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And we're very excited because your latest book, Range, is, in my opinion at least, the Consummate Athlete's official handbook. I don't know if we can say unofficial, official handbook. Yeah. And so we do recommend this. And you should, by the end of the podcast, it should be evident why. But thank you for writing that and for taking your time today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We often start with just having our guests sort of describe sort of their, sporting life, I guess, and that can be present or sort of how you got to where you are, just to sort of give us a feel, especially when people have sort of a bit of a varied background, but just sort of see where you're coming from as far as a sport, from a sport perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have to worry about sort of, youth specialization in sports, some of the things I write about, because nobody in my family was really that into sports. Right. But I was fanatical as a kid. So I still remember in middle school, I would wake up at, these were the days when it was Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann on SportsCenter. And I would wake up at 5 a.m. to watch the same half-hour segment play twice in a row. Which you couldn't get me up to do something like that for anything now. But I was football, basketball, baseball, a little bit of soccer, some martial arts. I did kind of everything when I was a kid. And even into high school, I played football, basketball, baseball. I ran cross country a season when I broke my arm playing football. And actually eventually later came to track because I wanted to kind of stay in shape for football. And really took to it and ended up, ending high school doing track, and then did that all through college and then for a year post-collegiately as a middle distance runner. So never having had running sort of being high in my mind except for the running that was done in other sports until I was sort of a late teenager. It then took off for me and became, one of the most useful skills I've learned in my entire life, honestly. So I still do a lot of that today, although I might call what I do today jogging compared to the running I used to do. But
right.
Yeah, but it's still a big, very important part of my life.
Your parents sound like very nice people to have to take you to that many practices as a kid.
Well, I think, there was... with high school, obviously you're already there, and actually lived fairly close to stuff and had, I would bike to a lot of stuff. I don't know if that's, I feel like I was allowed to bike to sports stuff at an age where now people would sort of raise an eyebrow if they saw a little kid biking on their own, but that was no problem. So I was constantly biking to stuff. I had a little scooter, and it was no problem to use that stuff around. And sometimes it was biking with a group of other kids. And so I was biking all over the place.
Okay, so this is really interesting. If you were so into sports and then you ended up writing at Sports Illustrated eventually, you kind of took a detour with what you studied in college, because it seems like you were kind of on the track towards, sports management or sports journalism or exercise science.
But then also you have an environmental science degree, right? Too.
Yeah.
So there's some range there, I guess.
Yeah, there's some well played. Yeah, I've taken a lot of detours, and I've gotten almost linearly less long-term goal directed since I was a teenager, and I've realized all the most important projects to me have not come out of things that I ever foresaw from far away. And so when I was a teenager, I was competitive, and I was dead set on going to the Air Force Academy and being a test pilot and an astronaut, and got the congressional recommendation and did the physical tests and all that stuff. I remember having to throw a basketball from my knees, which in retrospect seems like a really weird physical test, but at the last second, I sort of decided not to do that. And I went to college and thought I was going to study political science. Actually, that wasn't a great fit. And honestly, here's another place where running features importantly in my life. I was a walk-on 800-meter runner in college, and I became really good friends with the best 800-meter runner on the team, who was a senior. And he was a biomedical engineer. And I remember him telling me, hey, our college is leasing this campus out in Arizona. I went to school in New York. out in Arizona, like, you got to go out there. It's amazing. And I'm like, well, why would I do that and like spend a summer in the desert? And he convinced me because, one, he's like, you'll get some mild altitude training, and two, you can take a class out there, so you'll have a lighter course load during track season. And I'm like, sold. All right, great. And so I go out there and I'm just totally blown away. Take a geology class. It's all of a sudden, I've grown up in city, and it's like you're seeing life spread out horizontally, clinging to its vein of water. And, I'm running in kind of scenic areas that I've never sort of experienced before. And I was like, whatever I have to study to get more of this, and I got interested in how did this like basin and range system in Arizona, how did the earth systems work? And so I end up majoring in geology, picking up astronomy later because I come back to Arizona for another summer. And was planning to be a scientist. So I started grad school in geological sciences. And it was, again, another thing from running. And this one I have to, disclaimer, there's a sad part to this story. So just to give that heads up before I go, was one of my former training partners and closest friends dropped dead at the end of a race after a mile. He was one of the top ranked guys for his age group in the country. And I sort of wondered, how could that happen? And people were saying he had a heart attack. And I'm like, what does that even mean for someone like this? And so I gathered up a waiver. His family signed a waiver allowing me to gather up his medical records. And I, sort of investigated. It turned out he had died from this disease caused by a single gene mutation that's commonly misdiagnosed. And, as time went on, I decided I wanted to raise awareness about this. And so when I was a grad student, I was in a tent in the Arctic when I made the final decision that I want to merge my interests in sports and science and write about sudden cardiac death in athletes for a broad popular audience. And I'd grown up reading Sports Illustrated, so that sort of became my proximate goal, to write about sudden cardiac athletes, sudden cardiac death in athletes for SI. And in fact, that is what I did a few years later and became the science writer at Sports Illustrated. So it was really a merger, taking my sort of ordinary science skills and bringing them to a sports magazine where suddenly they were extraordinary, which really kind of carved out a career for me.
Yeah, and I think that science background is so valuable in journalism, and being able to, look at studies now and be able to write about it. I kind of had this as maybe a side question, but this seems like it works really well. You talked about the Fermi estimation and how it can cut through bullshit. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to, with sports journalism and especially, sports medicine writing, how can athletes read all of these, things that come out that are about new trends and, this study says, and it's, a sample size of 5. Is, any advice for athletes who are just so inundated by this information, how they can cut through the bullshit?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there are multiple levels of ways to do that depending on sort of, what time and inclination they have to go after that stuff. But so there are certain things that I think are like the top level decision-making heuristic for cutting through the bullshit, which are seeing if people like Christy Ashwanden and Alex Hutchinson have written about them, right? Because if so, that would be like my first level of thing, because that's like the quickest way to get to. Christy was until recently writer at 538, and Alex writes it outside, but they both do a lot of writing on their own, and they both have books about sports science out recently. So, or maybe if, in the past, maybe I would have said, look out if I've written about it as well, but I'm not doing that as often now. So I think that's a first line. The other thing to do, I think the next line, again, I'm giving sort of the easiest, the lowest hanging fruit answers here, is to look at people like that, on Twitter, or people like Mike Joyner of the Mayo Clinic, if they've been commenting on it, or Mike is someone that if you get interested in a study, like tweet it at him and he will for sure respond. And he's a physiologist and a human performance expert. So I think those are sort of some of the top line things. If you're actually looking at the studies yourself, I think the most important thing you can probably do is get some understanding of effect sizes. And there are places, you can do that online, because so many of the studies, you'll see this blaring headline, and then you go look at the study and realize that the effect size is so insignificant that, either it's a false positive, because if it's a smaller study with a small effect size, they probably didn't actually detect something real, or you don't care anyway. Because the effect size is so small and it's swamped by all the other things you could be doing. And that is, I would say, the majority of the studies. So I think, go look at that. Like if you see a like D equals something, that's telling you the number of standard deviations that this effect has in moving you toward like whatever they're testing for. So if it's like some really, really small number, 0.0 something, whatever, I would just like stop reading that study and like move on. There's nothing practical application for you, basically. So those are sort of multiple levels of heuristics there. Like obviously the best thing would be like get some science, education or whatever and follow the literature. But I think that's probably not the most realistic for most people.
Mm-hmm. Are there any headlines that have been driving you kind of crazy on this front lately? I have to ask.
Oh, yeah. I mean, constantly. There was that one recently about like the microbiome of endurance athletes. And I think that was like way overblown. I mean, there's one of the problems with stuff about the microbiome is that area is suffering from like a huge amount of false positives because of some of the methodology, right? Where there'll be like a small study and the gut microbiome of different people will be compared. And oftentimes the way that's being done is effectively causing this. Actually, the scientists are doing many, many different tests because they're looking for like differences in gut microbes, and they're going to find something, and they're not realizing that like you need more statistical rigor if you didn't, instead of coming in with a certain hypothesis of this microbe is going to be different, they'll just look for differences. And when you do exploratory analyses like that, you are subject to a huge number of false positives. And I think that's a lot of what's going on in microbiome research. Not all of it by any means, but a lot of it, and especially a lot of it that's sort of tailored at looking at health and performance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult thing for people to reconcile for sure. It's just, studies like that where they've sort of just thrown a bunch of stuff and seen what sort of stuck to the wall. And that might be something that in the future they could show, right? But essentially that's what you're describing with that, right? That's like, is that like a hindsight bias or what is that called? That's a...
Yeah, no, exactly. And you mentioned that. That's right. So exploratory analysis is good, but then you have to do the experiment again where you try to prove that prospectively instead of retrospectively. And so there's been a move in science for what's called pre-registration of hypotheses, where someone has to go register the hypothesis they're actually trying to test before they do the study, so they can't retrospectively then say, oh, we found this thing. And if you look at NIH required that for certain types of clinical trials, and then the proportion of positive trials plummeted after they required pre-registration. Because suddenly you're realizing people were just like retrofitting their hypothesis to something that popped out of the data, which gives you this incredible, high likelihood of finding a false positive, especially in the era of big data, where you can collect so much data, toss it into a spreadsheet, run a data analysis, and sometimes scientists will think of that as having done one test, but actually you might be doing like 1 million, depending on how you're doing the data analysis. And quite frankly, I confess in range that I now think the research I published for my master's degree is false, because I did that exact same thing. Like had a huge store of data, ran some statistical analyses, stuff pops out as statistically significant. I didn't understand the underlying process when I was hitting the button on that stats program, what it was actually doing. And so my own research was probably, I'm almost positive it's just false positive because of the same issues we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's useful. I think, I guess the other thing for the everyday person trying to make sense of like coffee's going to kill you and so is red beef or red meat, and then the next week it's everyone should be just only eating red meat or something.
Oh, the great paper on that, John Ioannidis, everything in your fridge causes and prevents cancer. Where he
exactly.
Looks at, I mean that's another thing. You look at if John Ioannidis has written about it, right? He's like the best methodological gadfly. I will say though, in that paper where he shows like all the studies on different foods and whether they cause and prevent. And I think the one thing that only caused was bacon. So, yeah, I know.
Well, that's really disappointing. I might have to edit that one out. I'm not going to lie.
That's right. So this will be like making our retrospective hypothesis, right? You're going to just edit out the data you don't like. So,
yeah, exactly.
Go ahead and be part of the problem. Yeah. I'm just kidding. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there. That just and that's such a good paper, and it's freely available online. So
that is awesome. Yeah, we'll try and find that one and link to it. Yeah, but I think all of this stuff is just sort of leading us towards, right? And I think the studies are meant to guide, sort of future things that, like we're pretty sure smoking's bad, right? And there was like that took a while, maybe too long, but, we sort of like mechanism and then went through and sort of, double blinding and everything else, right? And it's like fairly obvious. But a lot of this other stuff is very much in the early stage of like, it seemed like in these certain things, this was what was happening. But, short term, smaller samples. And I think that's hard. Everyone wants that, like, this is the answer.
Definitely. And also with smoking, right? So the effect size of smoking at a population level on deaths from cancer is enormous. Like, if you go to the American Cancer Society, every year they do stats, and if you look at like total cancer deaths, you'll see that lung cancer, lung and throat, cancers related to smoking dwarf all the other ones combined. And so you realize like how much, that we could prevent a huge amount of cancer if we lower smoking rates just a little bit. The problem is there's a 20-year lag period. So if you look at graphs of smoking rates and deaths from cancer, they're like look extremely similar, but with a 20-year lag. So it takes time to show up, which is obviously not ideal for that kind of decision making. But I think for most people, like don't get. It's sort of like investment advice that people get. Don't get like whipsawed by headlines. You know the principles of food, right? Like try to eat real food, and so don't go crazy with every successive headline.
Right. And I think that's almost a segue. In terms of a 20-year lag time, I wanted to talk a little bit about the early sport specialization, and I think even we can relate that to choosing your major, and I think you also compared that to sort of dating and sort of finding your spouse or friends or whatever. But the idea of sampling when we're younger, and the problem is we don't know the end thing. We don't know that
right.
that we're going to have David Epstein from someone who's studying geology, right?
Right.
So I guess my question is then, as parents, we're going through and, we have all these like, basketball and, hockey all year round and this sort of stuff. And we want to have kids on ice all the time. How do we, this is a Canadian example.
I was going to say
obviously.
That was so Canadian.
How do you reconcile that? I guess I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, two things I think since they're so recent, it'd be cool to point people toward are, and you reminded me when you said Canadian, because I was just talking about this with Steve Nash, who didn't touch a basketball until he was 13, played a bunch of other sports and went on to become the two-time NBA MVP, and he's Canadian. And we both watched this HBO Real Sports special about talent of sport development in Norway recently, and we're like so excited about it because Norway like exploded the last Winter Olympics.
Right.
It was probably the best single country performance maybe in any Olympics ever. And the HBO Real Sports looks at their development, and basically they have kids doing like all this broad stuff. They sort of like got rid of what we would see as formal competition here before the age of 12, and they have kids doing general physical literacy and all this other stuff, and clearly it's not hampering their development. So that was great. And then just out yesterday is this first part of this ESPN series looking at this like incredible rates of breakdown of young players in the NBA and how it relates, and their orthopedic surgeons seeing, these injuries that they used to see in 40-year-olds now in 18-year-olds and that kind of deterioration. And so I think there's some really, some compelling evidence building around this case. I think part of the problem is, and I think there are 2 points I want to make here. So part of the problem is, I think there are systems that are forcing kids sometimes to specialize, even if we know it's not optimal development, right? I lived in Brooklyn in New York until recently, and there was a U7 travel soccer team that met at a park near me. And I don't think there's a single human being in the world who thinks 6-year-olds can't find good enough competition in a city of 9 million people that they have to travel, okay? But those kids are customers for that league. And whoever runs it and has that financial interest doesn't care how they are as 20-year-olds, right? And just wants to keep those customers from other sports. So I think that can be a really hard thing for parents to engage in. But I think there are places that get the best of both worlds. Like France overhauled its soccer development. France, which won the last Men's World Cup, overhauled its soccer development pipeline decades ago to say, okay, we know kids are going to come into this sport early and want to specialize in it. So how can we do that while still getting the benefits that we know come from this broad athletic base? And so they will have kids in the pipeline, but they'll do like what the kids in Brazil do, where if you go to Brazil, you see kids aren't even playing soccer, they're playing futsal. Small ball, stays close to the ground. They're playing on sand one day, cobblestones the next day, over on a tennis court over the net with different one day with different numbers of players. And so they're still, playing something with their feet and a ball, but they're really varying the challenges up, almost on a daily basis. And so my hope is that we can have programs that capture some of the benefits of diversity, even if people are restricted to a single sport, because I think it's more about the diversity of the physical challenges that you face and the diversity of movement that you face, as opposed to, putting on a jersey from another sport, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up Norway, and certainly cross country skiing it was Norway, right? Yeah. Okay. And their cross country skiing and just their winter sport dominance. And on the news, I seem to recall that they were highlighting and it's certainly part of it, it's just part of their culture that they cross-country ski a lot, and they have all these trails that are lit part of the night. And we had Steven Seiler on, and he obviously knows a lot about that area. And I was asking him sort of is there preparation for skiing? Because cross-country skiing, they can't ski a lot of the year, so there's a lot of cross-training, a lot of striding, a lot of hiking, running, biking and stuff. And I was like, well, do you think that that's an indication then that actually this, for my own purposes, we'll call it the consummate athlete sort of approach. Do you think that this is worthwhile? And he wasn't so sure that there wasn't the specificity wasn't important. And I think it depends who you're talking to, perhaps. But do you think that's maybe part? Is that what you saw when you were thinking of Norway and sort of that winter sport?
I mean, it depends on the age we're talking about, right? I think early exposure, by the way, I think is great. But I think it's clear that they are not early specializing kids in any sport at all,
okay,
and are still doing incredibly well. You absolutely need specificity. But there are kids that are specializing much earlier than the Norwegian kids in the sports that the Norwegians are then destroying them in. Including kids in the United States. So I definitely think you need that specificity eventually, and that early exposure is great, but that the evidence really testifies to the benefits of diversity early on.
So how can parents stay above the fray in all of this, because of the temptation to put kids in all of these, exclusive VIP programs is huge. I was coaching cross country for the high school last fall, and I think half the kids, all of the good kids, quote unquote, on the team were also on club teams and leaving practice to go to their club team practice, and that was their life. Yeah,
I mean, honestly, I don't know. I think parents are in a tough spot.
Yeah.
I think there are other countries that have a more holistic development pipeline where this is easier for them, because unlike in the U.S. where we're sort of more balkanized about this. So it's if the coach of the 10-year-olds, if their only incentive is to make the best 10-year-olds, then they're going to do things that aren't the best for the 20-year-olds, because that's only their incentive. But there's some other places that aren't like that. So what can they do? I think, and by the way, this gets to, we'll continue on our Canada kick here. Researcher Jean Cote, the sports scientist in Canada, has made these interesting findings when he looks at the odds ratios of someone becoming an elite athlete based on the size of the city they grew up in. So the odds ratio, if it's 3, then that means you're 3 times as likely as normal to become an elite athlete in a given sport. And what he's found is that the odds ratios have been getting really high in small towns. And he's gone around and profiled some of these towns. And what he finds is that they are the towns that are small enough that you don't have to specialize to be, just make the 12-year-old team, basically. So you can sports sample early on before specializing, and that's where most elite athletes are coming from now. And so his sort of conclusion is that with this well-intentioned push toward giving kids a head start, we've actually, made sure that we have these great 10-year-old teams, but made sure that the elite athletes don't tend to come from those places anymore, from the places that have the really competitive youth teams. And so I think that's sort of telling. But what's the advice there? Tell parents to move out to smaller towns? That's probably not great advice. So I think, but I think the small town is just a proxy for the kind of developmental environment. It doesn't actually matter that it's small. So I guess my advice would be to try to look for these programs that, even if you aren't an individual sport, are encompassing some of the best principles of, physical literacy and movement diversity. So Judy Murray is a great example, mother of Andy and Jamie Murray, the tennis players, where she has a camp and parents feel comfortable taking their kids out of, the other development pipelines to give them to Judy Murray because of her name, because she's Andy and Jamie's mother. And then she'll have them doing stuff like they're playing tennis, but they're playing through tree branches. So they're doing all these other types of games. They're doing stuff with a racket and a ball. So the parents are sort of appeased that it's tennis-like, but it's still incorporating this incredible amount of diversity. And so I think look for programs like that. And, to that end, one of the things Steve Nash was talking about was exploring starting an academy that embraces these principles for the same reason as Judy Murray, is he knows that his name will carry the weight to make parents feel okay to do what basically the evidence says they should do.
That's interesting. I did want to ask you on that same line of thinking about sort of the small towns. We have clusters, and I'm sure you can name places through New York and stuff with lacrosse or different things like that, where it does seem like, a majority of the athletes come from that area, and they're not always like it's not New York City, but it'd be like this town, right? And it seems like hometown ends up being, and there seems to be a disproportionate number of athletes maybe from that area. Do you think that's as much hindsight bias as anything to do with the area, or do you think there's clusters based on the programs or for mountain biking? I feel like some of it's like the terrain and just like what's available.
For sure, what's available is a huge influence, right? Like there's a reason like a ton of the U.S. Winter Olympians come from northern Minnesota and Salt Lake City, because you have to have access to the sports. And the fact is most people in the world don't have access to most sports. I think it's hindsight bias in terms of our awareness of it, but in someone like Jean's work, he's looking at data in a more comprehensive way. So I don't think it's as much hindsight bias there. And there's a ton of natural variation, but I think there are some places that for certain reasons, and some researchers in Australia have seen this too, where they've seen the same thing, where the odds ratios have been tending toward the smaller towns, but also there are pockets within some of the bigger cities where they'll see these same things and feel that it is also part of the development there. And so, but I think if you were talking about elite athletes, I think the single most important thing for getting elite athletes is like marketing a sport and getting as many people as you possibly can to try it. And, people will bring a lot of different developmental experiences to it, and some people will come out. So that's basically what we do in the U.S., right? Where we don't have to be efficient like Norway because we have so many athletes. Like, right, the U.S. NCAA system probably supports more young adults in serious training in track and field than the rest of the world combined. And so we don't really have to optimize development. We can just like throw everyone into the funnel and take who comes out.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's maybe where there's a bit of that, like Norway, just like they're supporting, having facility to go cross-country skiing, so then families are going cross-country skiing. Kids can go cross-country skiing. I assume that happens. They just go on their own and stuff. And you talked about even just your family had you by happenstance, as much as on purpose, probably just in a location that you could access this stuff whenever you wanted, right?
Yep.
And I think that's a lot of it is like if the kid's able to go and do that stuff, fairly easily, and if they enjoy it or not, like they'll sample, I guess, on their own. But
yeah,
your story sounds a lot like mine was similar. Like I was just able to ride my bike in all different ways. We would build dirt jumps, but we could also go like trail ride or road ride, and my parents didn't even have to be involved most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing. Like part of specialization, sometimes if I say, specializing, people think that means, well, if you want to be a tennis player, you shouldn't play tennis early. And that's not what it means at all. You want to have early exposure for sure. But you also see, like, so after Germany won, the German men won the World Cup in 2014, there was a study out that tracked development of players in different levels in Germany. And what they found was that the players who went on to the national team played a lot of soccer, but early on it was mostly an unstructured way, athlete-led way. And not until they were 22 did they spend more time in technical training than athletes who plateaued at lower levels. And the athletes who plateaued at lower levels tended to be in the technical training earlier and not have nearly as much of that, sort of self-led. kind of play. And that's the same. So again, France, they noticed that. And so one of the guys, Ludovic Debreu, who helped design their pipeline, has this saying, there's no remote control. And what he means is the coaches shouldn't be trying to micromanage the players when they're younger. And so they've limited the times the coaches are allowed to talk to the players and things like that. So again, it's incorporating those principles, even within a given sport. But I also wonder, when you mentioned like we were riding our bikes around, I see kids now, they're like spending more time traveling than they are like doing anything athletic anyway. And I'm not really sure what sense that makes, and that probably is not so much fun for parents either, honestly.
Yeah, it's tough. Like I coach cycling is sort of my job, I guess. And yeah, it's tough, right, to reconcile like, okay, we're going to ride for an hour or so, everyone's coming to this center to ride, versus going and riding locally or exploring, like there's maybe a place to ride locally for the same or more time.
Without a 2-hour drive.
Yeah, it's just tough. I don't know. And again, like you say, it's tough on parents because you can't just, if you let your kid just ride, I guess you get in trouble now or something, right? So it's...
Yeah, when I had this one, like... Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no.
So I've had these two sort of panels. Well, one was a debate, and then one was just discussion with Malcolm Gladwell at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference that are both on YouTube. And he said, we were talking about this, and he said, I have a rule that the travel time to an event shouldn't exceed the time of the event itself. And I'm like, that seems like a good rule in some ways, except for like, he's a miler, so that would not be good for people who run the mile because then like you could only get down the block. Right. But I get what he's saying. I think it's interesting. And speaking of cycling specifically, Ian Yates, who was sports scientist and coach who's been involved with a lot of different sports in the UK and like revitalizing them and lead up to some of their recent excellent Olympic performances. He was actually working with UK Cycling, which of course like had a big turnaround. When I talked to him at one point, he said he was having parents coming in, parents of 12-year-olds telling him, like demanding that their kid do what the Olympians were doing right now as opposed to what the Olympians were doing when they were 12. So it's just sort of this like misunderstanding of how development works.
Right, which is tough, right? Because you see things on YouTube or whatever, and you want to go, and do those big Tour de France miles or whatever, right? Meanwhile, forgetting that, we could all just go and have fun riding around for an hour or two and probably get, that next step in the pathway for that 12-year-old.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of those top cyclists he was working with, I know he said, at least when they were younger, they were doing like some mountain biking and some BMX, like lots of different stuff.
Right.
They weren't starting on what they ended in right away.
Right. And in both cases, like they had ridden a bike. It wasn't like it was new to them. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's interesting. I like the rule of the driving thing. It comes to mind like when I actually met Molly, who's my wife. I flew to China, which was a 12-hour flight, and raced for a single hour. And then we had to fly back. But I did end up meeting my wife. So in the case of, you don't know where things are going to go.
In that case, I've changed my mind. You should travel as far as you possibly can.
Right.
Really,
no matter
really
what the event is.
broadening the sample dating pool there.
Yeah, there you go. So, I mean, if it's a combination of competition and dating, then like I think the principles maybe change a little.
Yes.
You could have just driven 8 hours the next weekend, Peter. That was on you.
Yeah, it would only be 8. Yeah, to race an hour again.
Yeah. But that's cycling. So I could keep talking about kids and early specialization, I think the whole episode, but I think we also wanted to talk about the idea of range for adults who maybe are, stuck in sort of, there's so many adults who get in that pattern of they exercise 4 or 5 times a week, probably in one sport. You go out and you do your 45-minute run 5 times a week. You go the same pace. You hit the same trail. I'm super guilty of this. But I think we should kind of get to those people a little bit. So one thing we both really liked from the book is you talking about the I think it was sampling Saturdays is what you called it. So we were kind of hoping you could talk about that as it applies to potentially athletes.
Yeah, Saturday morning experiments is probably the one you're thinking of.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I should give credit where credit's due. That is a phrase coined by the Nobel laureate Oliver Smithies, who he would And he used that because he said most of his important work occurred on Saturdays because he would go in when there was no one there, and he felt that you didn't have to be totally rational and could actually explore your interests and try other people's equipment and all this sort of stuff. And so he was, he said people would ask him why he went to work any other day because that's when all of his breakthroughs came. And so he was talking about, science and creativity, but I think that really applies, right? There's nothing, first thing first, it's better to be doing physical activity than not to be doing physical activity, even if that means you're doing the same things over and over, right? For sure. But, there's also the fact that if you want physiological adaptation, then like going to the gym and lifting the same weights the same number of times every day might prevent you from falling backward, but it also isn't causing, any kind of adaptation and because you adjust, you adapt to being able to do that thing much more easily and efficiently. And like most things we do, we sort of get in ruts of competence where when we become really competent and comfortable at something, we sort of stop looking outside for ways that we can improve. And I've been guilty of that and ended up kind of doing something off my normal writing path that really helped with this book. But so first of all, I think it's important for people to do things that they will be consistent with, right? But also sometimes to try different things. And there's a lot of evidence that you become less fragile as an athlete, which is important as you get older, right? I hear from lots of people who are older and they were active and they basically stopped because they had some injury. And they decide that injury like was the symbol of them like physically expiring and they just can't do this stuff anymore. And I've had that feeling too sometimes when I get injured. I'm just like, that's it. I just aged, I'm not going to get back. But then you do your PT or whatever and you're back. And it's like you never were injured. And I look at this data, like I should have included this. I'm going to write this down because maybe I'll put it in there afterward when I go to the paperback, because I spent some time with the physiologist at Cirque du Soleil, and they had this program where they decided to try, like looking at some of the data that was accumulating, where they would take their performers, right? And some of these performers are Olympic athletes from gymnastics and trampoline and occasionally like weightlifting. And they do tons of shows a year. Like these are really valuable, like really elite athletes. And they decided to take some of them and have them learn the basics of like 3 other types of performers' disciplines, not because they were ever going to perform them, but just to see if it would have an impact on their fragility. And they found they track their – so again, this is like the All Canada show. It's a Canadian company. They track their injury rates compared to Canadian gymnastics. And they found they had about a 30% reduction in their injury rates from doing this, having people – yeah, exactly. And these are, so then they implemented it at the National Circus School where they get a lot of their, their performers develop there. And so if you think of that, like these are performers who can't afford to make much in the way of mistakes, who are, in front of people constantly. If they feel something is so valuable that they're willing to take away time from what those performers are normally doing, they must really believe in it. And I think they had the results to show it. And we should keep that in mind because, one, I think it's always good to change things up just because, you do adapt and become so efficient at the things you're used to doing. And, we know this from things like periodization. You want to change up what you're doing, but also maybe it keeps you mentally fresh. But I think there's really an impact on fragility, and that we should try to change the way people think about aging, because I think, quite honestly, people's idea of sort of how athletes expire is just simply not true. And most of it comes from, either seeing elite athletes who retire, but in many cases that's doesn't have anything to do with their actual physical expiration date, or people get injured and they feel like that's it. I ran too much and now my knees are gone. But then you zoom out and look at data of like osteoarthritis in knees in people who run and people who don't, and it's much more prevalent in people who don't. But that message is not as intuitive and doesn't really come across. So. Those are some of the things I think about with respect to athletes as we age, and just not thinking of injuries as having expired, because if you do the kind of strengthening, and that you need to do to correct those things, you'll be back and it'll be like you were never injured.
Yeah. Did you shy away from, like, I can understand why you might, but from putting more of the sort of health-based stuff into the book?
I did. I had written about some of that before. So, like, I had written a story at Sports Illustrated about, for example, there was this epidemic in hockey of torn labrums in the hip that was causing all these other injuries because it can be difficult to diagnose because you don't have nerves in your labrum, and that was often coming from kids were learning butterfly style goaltending. Right. Yeah. When they were really young, and never mind that the best butterfly goaltender, Patrick Waugh, didn't even try it until he was already a pro. But right. So, I was talking to surgeons who were getting 20-somethings ready for hip replacements or seeing arthritis, in like late teenagers in their hips and stuff. And so I'd written about that. And Neeru Jayanthi, a doctor who did this longitudinal study of youth athletes and found that the best predictor of a young athlete, these were teenagers and down suffering an adult-style overuse injury, meaning like one that might affect their life or career for a long time, was if they were specialized. So 9 or more months a year playing the same sport. And this didn't mean they had to play less sports, but there was some protective effect of diversifying, which was interesting. So it didn't mean necessarily you just have to do less. It meant you have to broaden. And interestingly, he found that another good predictor was socioeconomic status, where better off families were more likely to have a kid who suffered an adult-style overuse injury. So it's like the rare health epidemic that hits people who are well off because they can afford those travel teams and all that kind of stuff. And I knew this stuff, but last one. There's 1/3 of major league pitchers now have had Tommy John surgery, right, and they're pitching less than ever. And I know Struan Coleman, who's one of the surgeons for Major League Baseball players who researches this, thinks it's set up by these micro tears in the ligament when they're younger, when they're throwing too much. But I decided to stay away from that because, having written about this sort of stuff and talked about it sometimes, my feeling was that for parents specifically, and in many cases for athletes also, it wasn't that influential. That that they were much more interested in performance message than health message. And we can see that in certain things, right? Like if health were the number one priority for parents, then we wouldn't have youth football, right, where people are running into each other with helmets. But I think the performance message, my feeling was that is what really reaches people. And so I sort of wanted to stay away from the mental health and the physical health, because I thought the performance message was a little more rare, and I wanted that to be front and center, just because of the experience I've had with the responses I would get when I would write about the health aspects.
That makes sense, and I think it's sort of a sneaky way of getting people in, right? Like all that other stuff, the mental health that should follow if performance is reasonable, good, and people are able to do what they want to do,
Yeah.
better or with more health, right, and with less injury.
Yeah.
I like that. I'm trying to think here where we want to go from here. You talk a little bit, what's sort of implicit, I guess, in some of this of sampling things is that you're going to end up being a beginner, quote unquote, in different things. So whether you're taking different courses or, playing around with something completely new in sport or at work or whatever. The one quote that I had highlighted was, and I think it's someone you were talking about in the book, used to be, you have to carry a big basket to bring something home. In terms of, I thought immediately about like going to a course or, getting instruction and thinking, this instructor is not very good, right? So can you talk about that, like in terms of being a beginner and, if we are going to try something new, how to do that, especially as an adult?
Yeah, glad you asked that. That you have to carry a big basket to bring something home was said to me multiple times by Frances Hesselbein, one of my favorite characters in the book, who took her first job in her mid-50s and then became this CEO who saved the Girl Scouts. And by the way, I changed my Twitter avatar to a picture that I took with her last month. You can see she still works 5 days a week in Manhattan at the mere age of 103 and a half.
Amazing.
So
yeah. Amazing. And check out that avatar because may we all look that good, at 70. But that she really made a big impression on me and became something of a personal role model, I have to say. And she would say that frequently, because she didn't have any grand plans, but she would extract a lot of knowledge from whatever she did. And thinking about that, I kind of got stuck with some of my own writing in range. I was having trouble figuring out how to structure some things and whatever. I was just in a rut. And So I decided to take a beginner's writing class in fiction, online fiction writing class. Just saw an ad for it, decided to take it. So there, nothing I've ever done matters to anyone. I'm suddenly in this beginner class. And one of the exercises was writing a story using no dialogue. And that was kind of a revelation for me because after the sports gene, I'd gone to ProPublica and wrote about non-sports things mostly for a couple of years. And when you get back into that sort of more newsy kind of writing, you use quotes to do a lot of explanation. And I realized I was doing that without really thinking about it. And that often means you don't actually have to understand things the way you should if you want to write them as clearly as possible, which is important in science writing. And it's just sort of lazy. And I realized I went back through all the manuscript that I had at the time and stripped a huge number of quotes. That made me realize what things I had to understand better, so I couldn't just put them in someone else's voice, and replace those with narrative writing. And I think it made it a lot better. And I didn't even realize that I had been leaning on it in that lazy way until something sort of knocked me out of it. And it was this beginner's class. And so then I got kind of intent on taking more of these classes. So like, this one sounds funny, but one day I noticed, a bunch of people dressed like wizards basically in my neighborhood, and realized something was going on at a hotel a few blocks away, and there was like a Japanese comic book convention going on over there. So I wander over there and sign up for like the beginner's Japanese comic book writing class. And I'm not probably going to write a Japanese comic book, but it's about structure and it's about dialogue and it's about narrative. And if you're carrying a big basket, like, you will bring something home. And I'm now convinced that there's no amount of beginner's writing classes I could take, from which I won't take something. I'll never stop learning from it. And I'm really intent on this kind of experimentation now. So I keep what I call a book of small experiments, where it's kind of like when I was a science grad student. I'll put a hypothesis, what skill do I want to learn? What interest do I want to explore? Things like that. And then having it forces me at least monthly to go do something to try to explore that. And then I come back and, reflect on that experience. And so it forces me both to do things because I need to enter something in it at least monthly, and to reflect on those things. And given that I have absolutely no clue what I'm doing next, this is sort of an important habit of mine for me.
How interesting. You're establishing a range, but still domain specific in some ways, right? Like you are pen to paper or typing, but just pushing yourself, and then also forcing yourself into that student role, right? You could have David Epstein's school of writing. I'm sure you could go and make that happen. It's very interesting. Motivational.
Yeah, and speaking of within the domain, I mean, I would say the single most important experience I ever had for book writing was doing a bit of film editing. And it was specifically for someone, a friend who got I shouldn't laugh at this. He got repetitive stress injury because he was doing too much computer stuff. And so he had to talk me through the editing. So I was just like the hand, and he was the brain. And what I realized when we were doing this is what you do is he has all this film. It was documentary. And so the film is like what reporters call your string. It's all your material. You gather your string. And then you cut it into chunks that you're going to use. The other stuff hits the cutting room floor. And then what you do is you just arrange those chunks so that the out point of one leads to the in point of the next one. And that again was like a real structural revelation for me. So when I'm plotting out what I'm doing, my outline is actually looking from one out point to the next in point. Like, how does the end of this section or chapter sort of get someone to the next, in point? And that's how I use section breaks and chapter breaks. And that's like been the core concept of everything I structure. And now I see it everywhere. Like, you can see someone like Wes Craven, right? Who his horror films, where frankly the material in some of those films I would say is pretty silly. But he was so good at structuring that's often you were still like, all right, I still kind of want to come back from commercial break and see what's next. And so it was really an experience in film editing. And then I would say the second most important one was I wrote a script for This American Life. And you realize when you're doing radio, you have to reinforce science points in a certain way as you go through the story because people can't stop and reread. And I think that's sort of a good principle, and that was really a great learning experience. So I'd say my most important writing learning experiences came from film and radio.
Wow. Yeah, that's, I think, motivation for all of us too.
Well, I'd say, yeah, I think I've had the same experience. Even just doing this podcast for the last 3 years has completely changed how I write, how I do interviews, everything. but it's, it was such a different form of journalism. So it's neat to have to experiment with that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, like people, a lot of even great journalists get stuck in these ruts of competence, right? Where we all get competent at something and then we just sort of stick at a good enough level. A great analogy for this is, and again, this is going to sound silly, but at some point I ended up reading a whole bunch of literature about speed typing, right? And how you get faster at typing. And it turns out that most people just from like doing it will get up to, 50 to 80 words a minute, but then you stick. And the fact is you can get like twice as fast as that, but you have to set a metronome a little faster and follow it no matter how many mistakes you make. And then you tick the metronome up a little bit every few days and you end up being like twice as fast. But it just is sort of this analogy to me that shows like how once we become competent enough, we'll sort of stick. And then you have to start doing things differently in order to keep getting better. Mm-hmm.
I like the rut of competence, and I was thinking about that for masters athletes in particular. I feel like when we start hitting this middle age, we'll say we kind of settle into, okay, this is where I finish in the pack. This is what my marathon time is going to be, like best case scenario, but it's probably going to be around this. How do we get out of the rut of competence as older athletes, do you think?
Yeah, and I should say, when I used that phrase to the economist Russ Roberts, he said it's actually a hammock of competence because it's so comfortable. Ooh. We stop standing up to look outside for what else we can do. I think for older athletes, their motivations for doing things are myriad, and so it sort of depends what they're trying to get out of it. But so one of the blessings in disguise for my own running career was being a walk-on, so that I had 2 years to experiment with my training where nobody cared if I was, I wasn't even getting invited to most of the meets. I wasn't traveling, anything like that. And so I had a chance to burn time. Well, it's not burning, it's investing time in experimentation where my race results didn't matter, to try to figure out the kind of training that worked best for me. And I think if people haven't done that, it sounds like it's not something you want to do, like burn a season doing that, but I think it's really important. And I think that's also where some of the art of coaching comes in, right? Is the coach, at a certain level, a coach can't tell you exactly what to do to get better. They sort of have to walk hand in hand with you as you try to, triangulate what works best for you. And I think that's why coaches are so impactful. So I think one thing to do is try to get someone who can play a bit of a coach role for you. And help you do that experimentation, and don't worry about investing a little time in experimentation, even if it means maybe your results go backward for a little while, because you're trying to learn about the training that best works for you.
And I think knowing, you have a section where you sort of comment on, as we get older, we're less open to experience, and and I think that's, if we can be cognizant of that, I think, at least some of us can do things like what you're doing, or like you say, get a coach, or take a course of different types. But what about the people who, maybe find that harder? Like they're in that hammock and it's a good hammock, and, they're to make that change, or to mix things up, or to get that metronome going, I guess. What comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, if they're comfortable in it and it's good for them and they're staying active and they're fine with the things they're doing,
I guess. Okay. Yeah, maybe that's okay.
But especially when we're thinking about lifelong athletes, I think. But I think, if there's someone, say, who's doing 5Ks all the time or something like that, I would say just try to make a little tweak then. Maybe you get into a trail run or like a mountain running race, or start with very little tweaks. Like you don't have to go totally crazy, or maybe see if, you can leverage some of your running and you can get in a triathlon and see if you're interested in the cycling and the swimming part of it. Yeah, like I don't think you have to take these flying leaps. You can just sort of try something that's a little bit different from what you're used to. Right. For a lot of older athletes, I think their training probably usually isn't as polarized as maybe as it should be. Like they're spending a lot of time going sort of medium hard all the time, when in fact if they took some of their easier days easier, they could take some of their harder days harder. And so if they're staying in that sort of moderately hard zone, they're sort of moderately easy on the easy days and moderately hard on the hard days, I think one thing to try would be going really easy on the easy days and really hard on the hard days. This was when Malcolm Gladwell and I became running buddies. We would do these interval workouts, and he was like, he was a Canadian provincial champ. This is like, how many references to Canada in this show? He was
It all comes back.
Yeah, he was a Canadian provincial champion in the mile. And one of the things I noticed with him, the Fifth Avenue Mile was one of the races he would look for every year. And one of the things I noticed with him was he was doing intervals way too deep into his training cycle, like days before his biggest race, real pounding intervals. I'm like, dude, you gotta back off. Like, just try 1 year resting more in the lead up, and doing your last serious interval session like 10 days out or at least 7 days out or something like that. And he did that 1 year, and he ran like, I think it was 4:54 when he was 51 or 52 or something, and that mile starts uphill too. I mean, that's a good performance. And I think he went back to doing the intervals right before the race the next year, but he was willing to tweak his training a little bit. He in that year where I was saying, all right, stop running 6 minute to 6:30 pace on all your easy days. We'll pound some intervals, but then stop them earlier before the race. So those were sort of smaller tweaks within the things he was doing anyway that I think made a good difference for one of his races.
Yeah, and I mean, we have that time, right? Like no one's, most of us are not getting paid, like you say. We're not NFL players who, the clock's ticking or something.
Yeah.
We can play with that and see if it helps, right?
Yeah, and you don't have to, if you're an endurance athlete, which I think is probably the largest component of masters athletes, is my guess, in the world, you don't have to deteriorate the way that you might think, right? You can there's like a cool case study of a rower who, I think he medaled in 5 successive Olympics, I think. Danish guy, if I recall. And you could see like his maximum heart rate and things like that would come down, but it would be compensated for by other physiological mechanisms like his cardiac output and things like that. And so if you keep going, you don't have to age real fast. So I don't think you should feel too much of a sense of urgency about spending a little time in experimentation.
Right. And you're still, it's still running. It's still like the difference should not be that much in those minor tweaks.
Yeah.
Well, we've kept you. I can hear your baby is...
Oh, you can hear him now? Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. We're at time. We've taken up your time, so I do appreciate that a ton. Did you want to leave the audience with anything? And certainly any of your social stuff. We'll get links to the book and whatnot in the show notes for sure. But anything to leave us with?
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes from the book is by a woman named Herminia Ibarra, who, since we've talked about like changing and trying new things, is she studies how people make career transitions, successfully or unsuccessfully. And one of the phrases she used that I loved was, "We learn who we are in practice, not in theory." And what she meant was there's all this sort of personality quizzes and career gurus that might want to convince you that you can just introspect and understand your abilities and your interests. But in fact, what the psychological research shows is that our insight into ourselves is actually constrained by our previous experiences, and that you actually have to do stuff to find out who you are. So she likes to say, act and then think. And I think that's sort of a powerful message that I think about a lot myself, about learning who I am in practice as opposed to having a theory, and that I actually have to try things I haven't tried before to learn more about myself. And so that's an approach I take both in my physical and my mental endeavors.
Yes, I found both the career viewpoint, and then I guess for me it transfers a bit into the sport. So I found that my favorite part of the book. Actually.
Oh no! Every other episode, he's either retiring from sport or changing careers.
But we're gonna pivot now. It's more of a pivot.
That's right. See, there's part in the book where I talk about the part about like good quitting, right? And the Army had this great success. Instead of calling it quitting, they've created something they call talent-based branching, where they allow people to try different career tracks, and a coach helps them then figure out how well it fit them. And they try others and others and others until they triangulate a good fit. So I think it's great. Instead of calling it like rapid quitting while learning about yourself, I'm just going to call it talent-based branching.
There you go, TM.
Oh boy.
Right there. All right. So we'll link to all your socials. Did you want to just give us what handles and stuff people can follow you at? But we'll.
Oh, maybe that's what you're asking for. Sorry,
sure.
Instead of like a philosopher.
No. That was perfect. Perfect.
Yeah. I'm at David Epstein on Twitter and davidepstein.com on the internets.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time, David.
Yeah, this is awesome.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. And
thanks so much for tuning into the Consummate Athlete podcast. You can check out my stuff over at theoutdooredit.com or by following me on Instagram and Twitter at Molly J. Herford. And you can check out Peter's coaching, training plans, blogs, all that fun stuff over at smartathlete.ca or by following him on Twitter and Instagram at Peter Glassford. And if you want to support this show and other awesome podcasts, please check out wideanglepodium.com for show info, other podcasts, bonus content, and to become a donating member so you can get all of that rad behind the scenes content and help keep shows like this on the air. And lastly, if you're enjoying this podcast and all the information that we're bringing to you every single week, do us a solid and pop into iTunes to leave us a rating and review. It takes you about 2 seconds. You can do it on your computer, you can do it on your phone, and it really helps us out. Thanks so much, and we will see you next week.